Today's reading is from Rays of the One Light, Weekly Commentaries on the Bible and Bhagavad Gita by Swami Kriyananda. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. We live in an age when people assume that knowledge should be available equally to all. In matters susceptible of judgment by normal common sense, however, everyone knows there are exceptions. Access to a control room for intercontinental missiles is limited by universal consent to a very few. Access to the controls of a passenger airliner is limited to those with the necessary knowledge for operating them, and also to those with the proper authorization. If people don't see the disadvantages of making more subtle knowledge universally available, it is only because they are ignorant of the risks involved. In the case of subtle knowledge, the main disadvantage is making it universally available is the harm it might do to one who isn't ready for it and who might even mock it. True, by mocking truth, he might undermine the faith of a few truth seekers. But then, such tests can also be beneficial as a means of strengthening one's faith. Again true, the clever doubter's misrepresentation of those truths may dissuade a few seekers from following the spiritual path. But if a seeker really is sincere, he will recognize the truth eventually because it resonates with his own being. No doubt, the greatest problem accrues to the shallow doubter himself. To give him an opportunity to affirm his ignorance might only strangle him even more from the truth, delaying the time when he will turn, as all people must eventually, to the light. Thus, the scriptures advise not secrecy, but discretion in the sharing of truth. Jesus Christ says in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7, "Give not that which is holy unto dogs, neither cast ye your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn again and rend you." And Sri Krishna says in the 18th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, "Never speak of these truths to one who is without self-control or devotion, who renders no service, who does not care to hear, or who speaks ill of me." Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om.
Good morning. Have an introduction to our wonderful altar there this morning. Just wanted to add that this is a yearly event to honor Babaji. Babaji being the great spiritual teacher of the East, and Jesus being the great spiritual teacher of the West. And so Babaji is deathless and here for this entire round of incarnations, and so we don't really have a birthday for him. So we just have celebrated on this day the greatness. He brought the techniques of revised the techniques of Kriya Yoga, giving them to his disciple Lahiri Mahashaya, one on the left, who then gave the techniques to Yateshwar, which over there, and then who gave it to Yogananda, who came to the West, to bring these teachings of intercommunion, because as Jesus had told Babaji, he said, the churches in the West are doing great works, but the power of intercommunion is burning low. It's not happening. And so let's bring the great power of intercommunion, those techniques of knowing God, to the people in the West, because he could feel the great yearning in the souls of many people. So it was a wonderful kirtan last night, and we decided to leave it up. It was in the middle, but over here, just so that you can enjoy it for a little longer. So this topic today, how democratic is truth. It's interesting because we're right in the middle, as you know, of all this political stuff, and I'm not going to talk about it, but, you know, democracy and democratic and all that, it just kind of rung a bell, so I won't talk about it. But anyway, it's you know, a coincidence, I think. So I wanted to start with a little example, and it's about 3 men who died, and they went up to meet St. Peter at the pearly gates. This is really an example, so it'll prove true. And St. Peter greeted them with a question. He said, you know, before you get through the gates, you're going to have to answer this question. And so the question was, what was it that you would like to hear the most people say at your funeral? And the 3 men thought, and the first man was a physician in his life, and he was very thoughtful about it, and he finally said, you know, he said, what I would really like most is for people to remember those years I spent in Africa where I gave my services to the sick there and the needy, and I did a lot to help them and lift up their conditions and alleviate a lot of pain and suffering. And St. Peter said, good, good, good. And the next man came up pretty boldly and said, well, as you know, I've been a very successful businessman, and you know, I have made millions of dollars, and I started my business, and I've been able to buy a couple houses and, you know, raise my family and give them everything they wanted, and so I want to be remembered for all that success that I created in my life. And St. Peter said, yeah, well, thank you, that's good, okay. And so finally the next man came up, and he kind of took a while and kind of staggered over and said, well, I didn't do anything really great. You know, I watched a lot of television, and you know, I managed to, you know, drink a little bit of good stuff, and you know, I got by, and you know, I think, you know, if at my funeral, he said, I think what I'd like to hear everyone say is, wow, look, he's up and moving. So it's just to illustrate that, you know, there's many levels of understanding in our populace, many levels of where people operate from. And, you know, they're all trying to be happy, and that's the goal of all of us on this planet right now. We want to be happy and avoid pain. And so we do it in the way that resonates best with the level of understanding that we're at. I know I was in Alaska. Some of you know I just got back from a 2-week trip. And for the first time in my life, we rented a motorhome or RV, and so we became an RVer. Anyway, you know, Alaska's beautiful. I mean, I went there mainly for the beautiful mountains and lots of glaciated areas we were in the peninsula, Kenai Peninsula, and the animals, the wildlife, because it's real, true wilderness. The only people really exist along the few roads that they have. They have so few roads that they actually name them. You know, it's the Richardson Highway or it's the Denali Highway. So every road and major road they name. You know, if we did that, you know, it would go on forever. But they, you know, a handful of names, that's their roads. So it's a very wild place. And what I became aware of was, you know, I love the nature and being out and seeing the sea otters and the whales and the moose and that kind of thing. But the people the ones that we met were a little different than what I was used to. And it was wonderful being friendly with them, but since I don't like to fish or hunt, I didn't have a lot in common with them. I don't know what to say. You know, they want to talk about fishing and catching that big one, and wow, wouldn't you like to go out in my boat? And, you know, we could catch these big fish in that area, these big halibut and salmon, and, you know, they were happy. In their own way, they were at that level of consciousness. Anyways, the ones I met, and so I was just pleasant. But you know, I didn't have that sense of being able to share who I really was with them. I just acknowledged where they were at and their happiness and joy. So it just pointed out to me very easily that, you know, this reading about casting your pearls before swine, it would have been terribly inappropriate for me to say, well, I meditate, and my goal in life here is to find God. I'm on this journey, and I'm getting rid of all these things that are holding me back. I mean, that would have been just ridiculous, because not everyone, and we all have family and friends who we don't talk to that way. We talk here because you're coming and you have a level of understanding that resonates with what we're saying. That's why you're here, because you understand at a higher level what life is all about and where you were going. Because we were all cast out originally from God, that infinite consciousness, as little sparks of consciousness. And these sparks of consciousness have been growing in our awareness of the spiritual journey we're on. And finally, in this human lifetime, after probably many incarnations, we begin to realize that really what we are that spark of God, and what we yearning for that happiness that we seek, whether we like to fish or hunt or whatever it is, we finally get to the point where what's really most important is to just feel that joy within. To feel that joy because we know that it's that joy of God that we're seeking. And so that's what Jesus is talking about in casting the pearls of wisdom before swine. It's not that your friends and family, I know when I first got on the spiritual path, I was so excited about the teachings, and I'm sure you all can relate to this. I just wanted to convert everybody, just this is it. How can you not understand this? And my family, when I got off the plane, this was when I was commuting, I was living here and they were still back in New Hampshire. And they picked me up at the airport, Boston Airport, and all the way back, I don't know how long, I just talked about all the stuff I was learning. I was so excited. And then I became aware that they weren't asking any questions, nor were they making any comments. When I stopped talking, it was absolutely silent. That's not like my family. I'm the one that's usually silent, and they're the talkers. And I finally realized that, they really probably weren't interested. And sure enough, as when I became quiet enough, they started talking about something else. It's just like whatever I said, I didn't say it. It just went like this. And we never really talked about it ever again. It was like I dropped this bomb, and I'm sure what they were thinking was, boy, she's really gone off the deep end, But gradually over the years, my family has more and more come to that point of understanding themselves too, so we can talk about it. And they're seeking some of this meditation and what it is that we all start to come to as our level of understanding begins to increase. It's not just that we have to know how to talk to people that way, because there's this feeling of wanting to share it because how important it is, and yet, people have to be ready to perceive it, and you have to understand if they're ready or not, just like you had to be ready before you could understand it. I remember one of those trips, I used to fly through Chicago, because it would always stop there at the O'Hare Airport, and walking through the airport, there would be these Hare Krishna group of people. This was back in the 70s, in particular, maybe some of the early 80s, and there'd be these groups of Hare Krishna people chanting away in the airports, and in various public places. And I used to think, just gotta stay away from them. They're a little weird. But I tried to be nice. And I remember one time as I was walking by, the woman at the end of the Hare Krishna, she had some books, and she was trying to hand these books out, and she kind of saw me glance over, and so she actually walked over to me and gave me the book. And she said, "It's here, I want you to take this book." And I opened it up, and it was really beautifully illustrated, all full of color, and she said, "It's yours, it's free, I really want you to take it." And I go, no, I'm really not interested, I don't want your book. And what I was seeing in this book was, what I remember was this lovely picture, a full-page picture of a chariot and all these white horses just galloping away, and someone holding the reins. And there was this blue man in the back of the man holding the chariot. He was blue, and he had some arrows coming out of his quiver. And I remember thinking, this is kind of weird. I didn't quite get it. But she looked at me, and the woman said, well, she said, please take the book. And this kind of bothered me. She said, I'll get into trouble if I don't hand out all these books. And so I took the book, feeling kind of sorry for her. And I went and kind of looked through it. But I so didn't resonate. It was the Bhagavad Gita, and I know it now. What I had was a treasure in my hands, but I didn't know it then, and I threw it in the trash. This beautiful book, I threw it in the trash. And it was years later when I had the opportunity to read the Bhagavad Gita, realize what a treasure I had in my hands. But I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to hear those teachings. I was off, thinking about my career, thinking about my relationships, that kind of thing. Where was I going to live? Goes on and on. Just the everyday aspects of life that we all get caught up in, and we're all a part of right now, as we all are. But we all now, as we begin to open up our awareness, we begin to see it from a different light, don't we? It's there. We have to go through whatever it is in this life that we have to go through. We can't just sit on the couch. That's not a good way to be. Unless you're so advanced that you can go sit in the Himalayas and meditate all the time. That's the highest. But most of us can't. As much as we'd like to, we just can't yet. But we will. We're heading towards that. The time will come. But for now, we go through our life in the highest way we can. And using these teachings, using our meditation, just try to bring that higher sense of joy and peace and love into our hearts and lives. Just like what the teachings are saying, we're living those teachings. And you share them when it's appropriate. When you see someone, perhaps some of your friends that you perhaps don't see that often, but they're old friends, and you could still have a relationship with them, but you don't want to overwhelm them with what's going on. But now and then you can help them. Maybe if you're a little more still and take some yoga classes. Yoga classes is a wonderful way to introduce the teachings because they're good for everybody, and right now they're pretty acceptable. Yoga postures are very acceptable in our society. And if they take them through Ananda, they get the higher level of yoga postures. It's more than just physical. They also get to work with the energy, and they get to learn how to feel the stillness within. And you can just help people by slowly giving them those ways of helping them. I know I've been doing that with my family, and it's been very helpful. Yogananda showed us. Obviously, he was a great yogi, and he could go into samadhi at will, and he didn't tout his greatness. People who weren't aware would just think he's kind of a not likable man, because he knew that he couldn't do that. He had to come at people with where they're at. And a good example was, there's lots of good examples of the autobiography of a yogi, but this one I especially like. He was he was talking to a kind of a fundamentalist minister, and they were always challenging him, of course. And the minister was telling him about the Bible, everything in the Bible is true, taking it literally. And Yogananda said, well, what about the story of Adam and Eve? And when the serpent came to Eve and was talking to her, do you believe that? And the minister looked at him very defiantly and said, well, yes, of course, in those days, serpents could talk. So Yogananda just said he kind of doffed his hat and he kind of said, I bow to this temple of ignorance standing before me. Because, he couldn't help him. He was not ready to listen, and so he just accepted it. And he just let him be and find out in his own way. Another time was when he was at one of his lectures. He gave many throughout the country in the 20s and 30s. And a drunk man came up to him and, threw his arm around him. And Yogananda had long hair and a robe. And, in those days in particular, people didn't dress that way. Nowadays, you see everything. But back then, things were a little different. And he threw his arm around him and said, "Hey, say there, Jesus Christ," he says. "How are you doing?" And Yogananda just smiled and just beamed love at him, just beamed that power of love. And the drunk man kind of looked back and said, "Hey, geez, what have you been drinking?" And Yogananda smiled and he said, "Yeah," he says, "it's got a lot of kick in it, doesn't it?" And, in other words, he was meeting them at their point. He gave them love and understanding in the way that he could. He didn't try to push the teachings on them. Only when they were ready could they understand that. Swami Kriyananda, a direct disciple of Yogananda, and the man who founded Ananda here, he showed this ability to work with all of us at the level that we were at, because even those coming to Ananda, there's always a continuum, in terms of understanding, and there's always a way to approach someone. If you approach them too quickly, you can turn them off. You can give them things where they are going to resist, and that resistance is going to make it much harder for them to understand. And some of the longer-term disciples at the village came to Swami Kriyananda and said, this new person that had come in here, he just isn't talking, he isn't acting correctly. He's doing things, being a little wrong, off in the way he talked and the way he acted. And Swami said, "Yeah, I know, he's having problems." And I said, "Can't you talk to him?" And Swami said, yeah, I'll talk to him. Well, they waited, and they waited, and they waited, and 1 year passed, and he didn't talk to them, and they waited another year, and the man was still doing and talking, acting the way he was, and Swami didn't do anything. It was the third year, sometime in that third year, Swami went and talked to this man, and the man changed. And he later said that, yes, if he had talked to them that first time, he would have turned the man off. He was not ready to hear what it was that Swami needed to tell him so that he could make the changes he needed. He waited until he knew the man had grew in his consciousness with that receptivity so that he could understand what it is that Swami was telling him, and then have the willingness to change. And that's what it takes, doesn't it? Somebody can beat on you a lot, and if you're not willing to change, you're not going to change, You just have to have that openness in your heart in order to learn and grow, and you're only ready when you're ready. At a higher level, in the autobiography of a yogi, Kashi Moni, who was Lahiri Mahashaya's wife, and of course mother to his children, to their children, spent most of her life as the wife and mother, and Lahiri was her husband, and she knew that he was, he had disciples, and she knew those things, but then again, first of all, he was her husband. And but one night she woke up, and there she noticed, or there up above on the ceiling was her husband meditating in a cross-legged position with this great light around him. And she was most surprised, of course, but she was most taken. She was ready, rather than like perhaps some women, if your wife and your husband was on the ceiling, meditating, you'd probably scream and you'd be really surprised. But she was ready, and she fell on her knees, and she said, "Oh, husband," she said, "I didn't understand. I wish I had have known before how great you were. I want the teachings of Kriya." And Lahiri came back down to the floor, and he said, "You are ready now." He said, "Before you were not. And yes, it is time for you to have the techniques." And at that time forward, she no longer saw herself as her husband. She saw him as her guru, and they lived that way for the rest of their lives. But she had to be ready. And even living with a great master, you have to be ready. The masters can't force it upon us. So too for us, we know about this, the readiness of learning. Obviously, if you have children, you can't, you try to teach them things, but when they're ready, they do it, right? And it doesn't matter that perhaps I know my granddaughter learned to read when she was 2, and she was reading, believe it or not, I still remember this, couldn't believe it. She was reading the Harry Potter book, that was the first one that came out. She was reading that in first grade, and she'd take it away from me. She didn't like the way I read it because I didn't pronounce those Dusseldorf and all those names very well. And so she'd take it away, and she'd give me the correct pronunciation, and she would read it to me. First grade. And yet my grandson, by first grade, he was barely reading the Dick and Jane, Run, Dick, Run, and Play, Jane, Play, and that book. But, he's no dummy. I mean, he's now in high school, and he's just as smart as she is. He's getting the good grades, and it's called readiness, openness, and especially, of course, in these teachings, it's more a lifting of our consciousness rather than just learning, being ready to learn things, which we do as children. So what I wanted to end here with, it was just talking a little bit about the virtues, which is the reading on the Bhagavad Gita that we had today. Virtues that we need to continue to develop. I'm not going to say develop because you are on the process developing them, but also virtues to look at in others so that you perhaps have a better idea of how much you can share. So when they ask, you can share enough, but you don't turn them off, which is what I did to a lot of people for a while until I understood. So one thing he said, the virtue is self-control, because until we can learn how to be more aware of controlling our reactions, controlling our desires, it's kind of like a big milk pail, and if it's full of holes and you pour that piece called milk into that pail, it's just going to leak out. And so until we can kind of plug some of our holes, we're a little less there in the world and more able to be in the world but not of the world. So we can play our part, but we can know that that's what we're doing and that it's God working through us. So self-control, just begin to be more aware of that. Of course, developing devotion is something we always talk about, because loving God with all our heart, mind, and soul was, of course, the first commandment of Jesus. And it's not just saying it, it's knowing it. And of course, that's the difference. Most of us love our families and our friends and, ourselves probably more. But it's a gradual unlearning of that, and realizing it's just God, It's God in our family, God in ourselves, God in every circumstance. Just begin to love that presence that's always there. So developing that devotion. Serving is another one. It helps to remove that ego consciousness that we have, where it's me, myself, and I for everything. As we begin to serve others in whatever way you can, whether, we just had a wonderful example of service in our community where a woman opened up her home to a family that needed a place to stay for a couple of weeks. And just being open to doing that. And just doing it with our fullest is such a wonderful example of just giving up your ego and your self-desires and just giving to others. And you get back so much when you give to other people like that. So serving in whatever way you can. And we always need to be positive too, because it seems like even though people are on the spiritual path, some of us have tendencies which aren't as desirable as others, such as perhaps fault-finding a little bit, perhaps our carping spirit, we don't mean to be that way, but just be aware if that starts to happen, where you're kind of talking about perhaps more the negative aspects of something rather than the positive. And when you catch yourself, just nip it in the bud, stop it. Because all of that also takes you down into lower energies, and we always want to keep our energy high. So cultivate these virtues And as you cultivate them, you will raise into those higher levels, and maybe you will be ready for that experience, some of those higher experiences that we still haven't had yet, but which will come when the time is right. It reminds me of, I was doing some gardening, and I was just, in my garden I have some roses, and this one rose bush I just love. It has a beautiful pinky coral rose, and there's this little bud that's just trying to open, and I'm thinking there's no way I can do anything to get that bud to open except just to nurture it until it's ready, and then it's going to open and be its full beauty. And so us too, just nurture those virtues that we have, and as we do so, we just open ourselves to become that light and to become that diamond that we really truly are. So let's meditate for a minute.
I'd like to read from Yogananda's Whispers from Eternity. Thy gentle voice saying, "Come home," I often heard. But through many lives it was drowned in the tumult of my wild cravings. I have forsaken the jostling crowds of desire. In the solitude of my mind, my devotion bursts to hear thy voice. Take away every dream memory of earthly sounds that yet lurks in my mind. I want to hear thy still voice, ever singing in the silence of my soul.